we are coordinating a research network on EU health governance, which is funded by UACES, so the Universities Association for Contemporary European Studies. If you're interested in staying in touch and seeing a little bit what kind of activities we do, we have a Twitter page at EUHealthGov and also a website, EUHealthGov.org. So feel free to have a look and sign up to our newsletter and follow us on Twitter if you want. So there will be also a Q&A at the end of this session. So I think, I'm not entirely sure, but I think you might be able to turn on the mic and also maybe the video. Oh, hi, hello, Catherine. Great, I see the chat is also working. So you can post your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hands and ask questions at the end. Also for information, the session is recorded. So you make sure you keep yourself on mute if you don't want to appear on a recording unintentionally. Okay, so so for today, we are extremely honored and thrilled to welcome Professor Meri Koivusalo as our speaker today from Tampere University. So thank you very much, Meri, for being with us today.
Thanks a lot.
Yes. So Meri, you're a professor of global health with a background in medicine, public health, and health policy. And you've been researching the health impact of non-health policy areas for a long time now, with among other aspects the health in all policy concept, and also a focus more on trade and health within and beyond the EU context. And so in some of your latest work, you analyzed the extent to which the EU safeguards health services when it negotiates trade agreements. And so I wanted to open up the floor to you and ask you if you could tell us a little bit more about your findings and about your research in that area. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, and really nice to come to talk to you all. I'm having a little bit of a presentation to kind of give you a little bit of an idea what I've been doing, and I hope that I've now managed to kind of show it so that you all will see the presentation, and much of what I am going to present is my journey to kind of looking upstream on a health impact. So a lot of my background work has been to kind of look at health in other policies and other policy areas within EU and elsewhere, and then kind of when you look what kind of issues affect the kind of health policies, you go further upstream in trying to analyze their implications. And my background is in health, and it started actually with working on environmental epidemiology, and with trade and environmental protection issues, you could kind of see certain kind of repercussions, and that was the kind of context that I got interested in trade initially. But since then, I've been working more on services and EU health policy, and now kind of later on global one. But I think what I'm now presenting you is something that grew out of the frustration that what I was doing, because I was working in the in a national research institute for health, and quite closely with Ministry of Social Affairs and Health. And I was doing this kind of maybe unofficial work in scrutinizing the trade agreements in terms of, especially in services, of what there was for that the health services commitments that Finland had made were not included. So I was just going through and looking at a particular sector on health services, and then came, and it was a long time after the kind of GATS, things didn't move very much, and you had TISA, but TISA didn't move very far, which is Trade in Services Agreement. But then came the kind of new generation trade agreements and a change in the kind of negotiation practices. And this is a story about my kind of frustrations about some of the EU policies when actions don't match aspirations. And also to kind of, if you have a kind of a health issue, the kind of a background of what kind of questions and what kind of arguments become then a point of dispute, or kind of question of different views of importance or covering. So this is actually about an article I published in the Globalization and Health, which was about the kind of services negotiations and the European Union making strong commitments that the EU would not kind of make commitments on the health services. And as a kind of a little person to look at all the detailed services schedule that Finland had done, I was following what was the situation in this respect for the services. And in some sense, EU made a really great deed for a lot of us researchers, because I would say that there is a treasure trove for people who want to look at health and trade, because EU provided the actual negotiation documents public. So we've got, you can see and you can kind of actually look at the real negotiation documents, because that was the restricting factor previously. But the other thing is that the new generation trade agreements are also kind of a new, and they are rules-based negotiation much more than before. So it's not about tariffs and trade, but it's about regulation. And also that they were between high-income countries rather than imposing what is already present in the EU to low-income countries, which has been part of the kind of a bilateral agreements and their roles. So in that sense, if we think that EU is the kind of the greatest trade, can you hear me? Because I can't move my slides. Okay, good. So now we kind of survive that one. So in terms of the EU is the greatest kind of trade bloc in the world. So there is a kind of a question of what kind of a change and what kind of impact we want to see. And if you do look at health and health policy, so you can kind of look at the kind of a different aspects that the trade agreements have. So you've got a trade flows, and they're what's most kind of important generally is about the products that you don't want to be consumed too much. Then there is the issues of policy space, and that applies to services, investments, and regulation. So the question is public policy, how and if you can kind of implement regulatory measures, how you kind of regulate. And this is something that has kind of become of much more importance than before. And then there is the kind of a commercial policy interest and corporate benefits which arise from the trade negotiation. And I think that that's also the aspect that this has become kind of a stronger articulated more lately, which is based on the intellectual property rights, trade secrets negotiations, and then last but not least, investment protection, which is clearly kind of something that it's kind of a negotiated for the kind of the transnational kind of corporations kind of with their influence and on the agenda. But at the same time, we see kind of the emphasis on the positive trade agenda, like the inclusion of labor, environment, antimicrobial resistance, and all other kind of sustainability chapters. And the question, of course, is then what the kind of trade negotiators call the Christmas tree decoration of the trade negotiation. What's the impact of that in practice? What's the impact on the global governance? I mean, do we want to put the health issues in the trade agreements, or should trade agreements oblige that what has been agreed in WHO or in ILO or elsewhere? And why should all kind of policies be governed by trade agreements? And I think that is sometimes not discussed enough when people are kind of emphasizing the role of trade agreements. So we wanted to kind of compare what was promised in terms of services, in terms of what was then negotiated in the text, and to kind of look at what kind of policies were promoted. And I think that what comes out of the kind of a new generation trade agreements, and when you look, it's not necessarily the tariffs, but it's the defining the new normal of what is the trade policies. So in services or in kind of technical barriers to trade, so you kind of define what is kind of the level playing field, what is the appropriate standards. On services, the market is the normal. You have to kind of claim, if you want to regulate, you have to kind of make evidence and make a kind of a case that the government needs to kind of be in the field. So it kind of sets the rules of the game in a kind of different position, and I think that is something that then tends to become kind of more difficult to address under multi-level governance. And then I think that was first anticipated actually in the field of health, and the well-known kind of cases of European Court of Justice and internal market regulations kind of impeding on the health systems and health services, which then kind of was kind of reflected actually in the Treaty on Nice quite strongly, that you should have exception in the services trade in the field of health, social and educational services. But what you didn't do in the Lisbon Treaty, that was very much watered down with a so-called emergency break to kind of limit that it's you could only if the kind of the agreements risk seriously disturbing the national organization of such services, which is kind of I mean, if you come from trade or health, your interpretation of that might be quite different. But it also provided to us to kind of compare something that you could compare the audiovisual services, that, you know, if you say that you protected health so well, so why did you protect it as well as audiovisual services? Because it's the same paragraph that you make a similar kind of commitment. So we kind of looked at the audiovisual services on that. The third thing, what I think is important in the trade negotiation, is what you kind of imply, and what it's the assurances. It's that you get the extra kind of declarations, you get the extra letters where they assure, but they're not kind of a set, or you have the preamble text, but it's not in the real agreement text, and there is no kind of hard safeguarding of issue. And there is also this kind of a waffly kind of a language which emphasizes, for example, the not lowering existing public health standards or regulatory standards, which doesn't necessarily say that your future standard or making the regulation more strict could be more difficult. And I think it's this kind of a minor looking kind of changes, which when busy people read them quickly, don't really matter, but which then in the details can matter a lot, like and the kind of assurances of right to regulate, or the issue of what is implied by legitimate expectations for investors, for example, or what is implied by high regulatory standards. Is it about standards of protection of environment and health and other issues, or if it's about protection of investment and IPR, or is it about the higher kind of a barrier to regulation that makes them more contested regulatory standards that you actually seek for, that governments can't just put regulations against your trade interests without kind of having a full load of evidence to do so. So there is all these kind of things of how you interpret the different kind of sets of issues, and there's the issue of necessary, what you imply as necessary. EU likes the word necessary in contrast to US, for example, and yet the necessary can imply a lot. So those were the kind of so part of my kind of question was that are there any other issues that would safeguard the health systems beyond the the actual chapters. And the question is, of course, that a lot of the time the assurances are too general and not necessarily reach to the chapters that have come, and obligations that have kind of become articulated as part of the trade agreements. And for anyone who kind of looks at the trade agreements, I think that the most kind of important in practice part could be the investment protection part, because it's a new, we don't have much of a kind of prior legislation in terms of the trade agreements and the health, but we actually have a case in Slovakia, which is kind of quite interesting, because there they kind of the arbitration board did not want to remove health services from arbitration because it was included under the kind of investment protection chapter. So if you don't want to have health services included, you have to be making that explicit. And I think that this is a message that was not listened to at EU level, and there was much more stronger kind of a willingness to put all services, including I think audiovisual services, under the kind of investment protection regime. And then there is another part of that same kind of issues when you kind of have to argue about a case with the policymakers. Then there's a lot of emphasis on regulatory politics, that you know there are cases that the governments failed, or that they were kind of a misjudged results. But I think that there's Pelk has done really nice kind of analysis, making another argument that the fact that we've got failed cases doesn't necessarily mean that the system works, but that it is used to deter regulatory measures, because corporations are making kind of cases and putting cases under judgment which don't have a good ground to be done so. And then I think that that's a kind of a different way to say that okay, you can interpret this in a different way, because I think that a lot of time, especially in the dispute settlements, taken as granted that because of the tobacco cases, you know, you're right, it shows that the system works, that investment protection is not an issue. But of course, it's not just the cases. I mean, there I'm totally with Martti Koskeniemi, who was really adamant on kind of making the claim that it's not the cases, it's the system which actually kind of governs what is done. And I think the second kind of area where we can see that the health and the trade issues are quite in conflict is the kind of issue of intellectual property rights, where there is now kind of a EU stance which is quite strictly opposed to the kind of access to medicines issue, and which is kind of not necessarily moving, irrespective of the fact that we have got quite a kind of a global coalition against or for the TRIPS waiver, which now even includes the United States, but and the opponents include basically Switzerland, UK, and EU as the main opponents to the kind of waiving IPR rights during pandemics. So it just shows a bit about the kind of also the line in terms of the balance of the consumers and the rights holders in the context of EU external policies. And to my mind, that also is likely to kind of lead to issues which we have in internal policies, and which were discussed actually in certain kind of measures when people try to address the pharmaceutical pricing within EU. So the idea that it's just a matter or something for the developing countries may not be the case necessarily in terms of the trade agenda. It is shaping our policies, and it might be shaping much more what the Commission negotiates in internal markets. Do we have what kind of trade agreements we want to negotiate? And in this respect, it is quite interesting, and I find kind of really important to kind of look at the positive agenda, which EU has presented that its trade strategy wishes to have the kind of a more positive agenda, which would include human rights, gender, labor, environment, and sustainability as part of the trade agreement. So what are we kind of signing in if we want trade agreements to take all these issues? Do we want trade agreements to comply with policy priorities in other sectors and other areas, and agreements made in other fields, and priorities set on other ways? Or are we kind of seeking to have a kind of a broader meta-regulation, which is multi-level and global governance through kind of a very much commercial policy emphasis, and centralizing the importance of commercial policy and market kind of a mechanisms at the core of what you want to do? So I think it is really challenging to kind of think about what is the positive trade agenda and where is the EU role as the greatest trading bloc in future. So just to kind of think about even the task of transforming trade policy for the benefit of public health might feel a bit kind of limited considering the resources, capacities and other things. But I just want to say that, you know, the tanker is gone. It's not anymore. So something did happen irrespective of the kind of magnitude of the task. So I just hope that we'll see a lot of kind of people coming up to the looking at the upstream of health policies, because it is the way how the debate and the discussion starts on the kind of a purpose of the EU policies and what we really want. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Meri. That was really interesting. A very clear presentation and a very clear overview of your article and beyond as well. I had so many questions I want to ask you, and so many things that I wanted to address with you. So I suppose my first kind of starting point is when I read the article, I was really struck by when you explain just how health is kind of scattered in between different chapters, and that it's kind of difficult for public health interests to kind of get everything together and make sure that they don't miss anything, because various elements of that are related to health services might be covered in different aspects. And as you explained in your presentation now, that this kind of shapes what's the new norm and what's the default and what's the sort of the default trajectory. And I couldn't help but think of like parallels with more internally in the EU, the better regulation agenda as well, and how the two together maybe kind of bring about a landscape that just always favors like more liberalization, more deregulation and sort of consolidation of corporate power over states' capacity to regulate. And so I was just wondering, what is your opinion on where to even start tackling that from a public health perspective? Because in better regulation debate, there's a lot of talk about health impact assessments. And do you think health impact assessment is also something that is useful in this context? Or do you think it's more of a structural change? And how do we even start advocating for, as you say, the more positive kind of trade agenda? And relatedly to that, my question is whether in trade agreements as well, we see a move towards more, stakeholder consultation regimes and really stringent impact assessment, whether that's something that's also there in the trade negotiations.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we started, we do health impact assessments now with the trade agreements. And when I started quite early in the 2000s, we kind of looked at the EU policies and the health impact assessments. And there was a lot of interest in enhancing the role of health in the impact assessments. But I have to say that somehow I fear that we've lost the game. Mm-hmm. That somehow suddenly we've got now the trade impact assessment coming up, and if you look at closer to the regulatory cooperation, it's very much like regulatory impact assessment. So it kind of promotes the impacts on business, not in terms of the other way around that perhaps was kind of thought about initially. So I think that somehow I feel that unfortunately the health impact assessment issue in terms of the trade agreements is it's kind of lost, and it's turned against and towards us, that we now kind of have to show that our regulatory measures are not against trade, or our tobacco regulation is compliant with trade agreements with other countries. And I think that's an obnoxious kind of requirement in a way. It kind of pushes the kind of boundaries closer, but of course it's kind of very useful for especially transnational corporations to kind of have that, because then you can kind of you will know what's going on. And I think that that's why the stakeholder issues are important, because if I would be a transnational corporation, I would have a really big interest in what the EU does in the internal markets, 27 countries in a one shot. And then I would try to influence EU stances on trade, because that would be also kind of be very effective politics from my point of view. So that is the problem, is the kind of that the beneficiaries currently from the negotiations will be the transnationals more than the others. And I think public health, keen to kind of control markets of transnationals will be kind of a bit in trouble.
Yeah. Thank you for this. To be honest, I was also a little bit under the same impression that pushing for a health impact assessment is almost kind of legitimating the high burden of evidence that public health is supposed to provide to kind of justify any exclusions or so, and that and then on top of that you have also issues of how to measure impact on health compared to how to measure kind of impact on business is much more difficult. So yeah. You mentioned also with COVID and the TRIPS waiver, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on the evolving narratives around trade and health after COVID, because my impression was that there's kind of a bit of a binary position emerging there, with either the sort of the protectionist rhetoric in relation to vaccines and supply chains for PPE and so on, and the versus the sort of the globalist argument, and that these are two binaries that are put in opposition to each other. And I was wondering, for someone like you who's arguing for something much more nuanced and much more kind of technical and taking into account complexity and detail, how does public health interest should kind of position itself and articulate a coherent position that is neither this or that? Or how do you see that evolve?
Yeah, I think that the articulation of the public health is international, and it's kind of but it is also about the essential services. It's like kind of what needs to be local in terms of the pandemic. So you want to have regulations which ensure that you'll have access to these products, but it's not necessarily means that they need to be produced in the case of pandemic that they are need to be produced in your interest always, or kind of that all of your kind of a production is based on kind of a nationalist or protectionist kind of a model. And I think that the articulation that the real problem is between protectionism and globalism is pretty wrong in the first place as well, because I think that even Trump was keen on making trade deals. He just thought that the US had been making too bad deals. He wanted to make better deals. And in terms of the kind of, if you look at the kind of politics of how things are evolving, then there is much more kind of a debate about what kind of international agreements, what kind of rules, rather than just all, our kind of a national interest versus kind of a global interest. But I find it kind of a really slightly kind of disconcerting in terms of the vaccines, because EU countries and member states have really acted quite national interest based. So all the vaccines have gone to vaccinating the Europeans first. And then, I mean, COVAX is waiting for kind of, there have been a lot of pledges, but you don't have very many vaccines because there is lack of kind of availability. So at the same time, then at the WTO, EU is opposing multilateral, human rights-based kind of articulation of pandemic waiver and access to kind of a treatment. And I think that in that context, the EU is favoring clearly through the ACT Accelerator, the bilateral deals with the pharmaceutical industry, which is not multilateral option, with the WHO engaging more prominently. So the question is, where is EU standing on these issues? That it can't kind of play at the same time global actor and global kind of operator, and yet then when it's industry interest go to and be bilateral and national interest. And I think that people in the health are actually much more international in terms of the pandemic requirements and common issues, but I think that we also need to kind of think about the way how kind of issues are dealt with, because in some sense it's very hard for the national state to say that, okay, you take half of your vaccines and then we transport them elsewhere, because it's in the interest of a lot of our national state to kind of do that and try to kind of serve first their own kind of populations. But at the same time, we should have a global mechanism that allows it to be so based in a way that kind of makes it possible to produce vaccines for all. So, and currently it's not the case. And our kind of international operators are actually defending very nationalist policies. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if I made myself clear, but I think that you all kind of know the problems within the national interest and vaccines and that kind of
Yeah, absolutely. But I think, also that brings to beyond vaccine, it raises interesting question about the sort of the EU entity, how much it can do, its capacity, and the extent to which member states, are involved. Because the other thing that I thought was also very super interesting was the comparison with the audiovisual services, right? Because I feel like, as someone who's not an expert on this particular issue, I tend to think of, okay, the EU negotiates, and I don't think I was particularly aware of the extent to which member states can influence that. And so that raises the question, do member states, in your opinion, even have a consensus on how health services should be dealt with in the trade agreements? Or whether there's maybe even potentially, I suppose my assumption here is whether maybe there's also maybe a tendency of member states to blame the EU for its for an agenda that they would agree with domestically as well, but because it is unpopular with the population, they say, okay, it's the EU pushing this liberalizing agenda when actually it's member states as well. Because you say that they could have gone much further, as we've seen with the audiovisual services, right?
Yeah, and I think that sometimes EU Commission was kind of a more, safeguarding the interest that the member state didn't care, or they were more willing to kind of go further. So it's not just it's not straightforward always. And I think that the discrepancy is as much at home between the trade departments and the health departments and the policy priorities between those two and the general politics of it, as well as then the difference between those and the EU and where in the EU you make the decisions. For example, I've been kind of interested in the fact that what you say that in the EU the Coreper now makes much more policies, because during the pandemics it's been the only kind of there's been kind of decisive power. So there is a kind of a certain shift in terms of the kind of decision making to the kind of a permanent representatives of the member states, which now play a greater role than the policymakers per se. So you could say that there is this kind of a twist between the different policy aims within the member states and within the EU between the different policy priorities. And I think that one should kind of just think about how to kind of get the EU agenda to be really recognizing that the health and the kind of a social policy and the other issues are on its agenda, but it may not be the form that they envisage, that you've got a chapter in the trade agreement that is the appropriate form, but also the defensive interest is their interest. And in the very old days, Lamy was kind of saying that EU made actually kind of a promise that they wouldn't make any calls or claims on other countries to kind of expand trade liberalization on health services. So EU has been able to kind of have a kind of make this kind of steps to kind of try to kind of limit what could be tradable and what could not be tradable. But I think that there are kind of things that you need to remind all the time to kind of what you can do. And eventually I think that if you would have a coalition of countries kind of articulating very strongly about health and social services or welfare states, then it would be very hard for Commission to do in spite of the kind of powers or competence. And I think the same applies to some extent with medicines, that they've not got to the top of the national member states agenda enough to matter enough for the trade negotiations. And I think that that's the kind of a thing we may need to kind of think about differently, especially now when it's not just kind of a solidarity towards other countries, but in EU as well.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. Thanks, Meri. I can see that there are already quite a few hands up, so I feel like maybe I should stop the comments and rather invite people to ask their questions to Meri. So I think the first one that I saw was Valeria.
Sorry, there's a question from Elizabeth in the chat, and then there was a hand from Valeria, and then from Silke. So maybe I'll read out Elizabeth's question just in case anyone is on a device where they can't see the chat, but Meri, you should be able to see that anyway. And then Charlotte, I'll leave it to you to call on Valeria and Silke. So Elizabeth is asking, I would like to know your opinion on how different non-trade interests are considered in EU FTAs. Do you have the impression that public health concerns are not granted the same protection as environmental or labour concerns? And Elizabeth notes that the latter have their own chapters devoted in FTAs. But that question's there in the chat, and then I'll leave you, Charlotte, to call on the hands that are up.
I think that actually health used to be the trump card, because health is the only area where you've got the specific kind of safeguards in the trade agreements. So previously health used to be treated differently. And if you're really honest, health services have been treated differently by EU in comparison to environmental or other public services. So I don't think that health services have kind of necessarily been treated much worse than other non-trade interest areas, but because I think the chapters have not added very much. But I think that that in principle there is a necessity to think not only in terms of the added chapters or kind of including more things to the trade agreements, but also thinking what you might kind of how you might kind of cushion or limit or kind of and so I suppose restrict a bit the trade provisions to allow policy decisions in the other fields to kind of go further. So I think that and to kind of hinder the kind of the incentives for global corporations to seek trade agreements kind of a safeguarding for their interests. So I would say it's kind of a mix, and in some sense trade is a really strong argument because it can really disturb trade and everything else if you don't sort it out, as we have seen in the last 2 years.
Okay, thank you. We have Valeria. You had your hands up for a long time. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, we can. Great.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I would like to take advantage of your expertise, Meri, I think we did meet some time ago, but many years ago. Actually, I come to you from a very different perspective. I'm interested and I've been working on EU development cooperation with Africa, particularly with sub-Saharan Africa, for the last 10 years or so. I find it always very difficult to try and understand what goes on in trade agreements, to be honest. And I would like to ask you if you can sort of say a few words, or at least what you think about the implications, in particular for Africa, of the current trade agreements and the new negotiations with Africa. Because actually, I think that it's not just an issue with respect, vaccines are just a minor part of the picture, because it's totally useless to send vaccines to Congo when then Congo will send them back, because they will expire before Congo can even actually use the vaccines. I'm just using an example. So the problems are elsewhere. It's not just the vaccines. So, but for sure, at least as far as trade agreements are concerned, with respect to medicines in general, there's an issue there about the fact that the EU is saying certain things, trying to balance the protection of intellectual rights with actually the affordability of medicines, even in poor countries or in least developed countries. And then when you actually go into the nitty-gritty elements, regulations, you see that it's practically very difficult to actually guarantee that those medicines do get to the places where they're needed. So I would really like to hear what you have to say about, because I really didn't understand fully what your message was in terms of what are the implications of the current framework, EU current framework, with particular reference to Africa, because Africa is right in front of us, and it's definitely a priority for the EU, because it's not Latin America, which is so far away. Africa is just in front of us. So I think that global health issues should be a priority for the EU, but certainly they are not. I've been analyzing development cooperation and where the money goes, and it doesn't go to health, no money. And in fact, even the current commissioner for development has no priority whatsoever for health. Thank you.
Thank you, Valeria. Meri, if you want to...
I think that in terms of the Africa, I mean, it depends about what you kind of, Africa is a continent, so I think that different countries will have got different issues with respect to trade agreements. And I think that in South Africa, they've been rather critical about the intellectual property rights and the investment agreements, which have been used against certain kind of renegotiating the projects and trying to kind of look at different ways in terms of contracts that have been done earlier and which have been discussed widely in terms of water and in terms of salaries in Egypt and in terms of course, mining and what kind of a politics you deal with mining and extractive economies. So I would say the role of trade agreements in legitimating extractive economies would be the kind of a main factor. Whether it would be directly kind of how it directly relates to health is then as much in terms of the kind of alcohol, tobacco, and the kind of related regulatory issues that may be kind of applied in favor of those kind of proponents to kind of enhance their policies in the name of the trade agreements. And I think that that's the use. What you see is that they're used against government efforts to do particular issues. If you talk about Congo or kind of countries which are in the least developed countries category, I mean, they are out of trade agreements. They would be great to kind of be part of the trade agreements. So the issues are pretty much different, and then it's and I would not kind of I think that there is a problem sometimes that we kind of look at trade, and then we look at the least developed countries, and they say, okay, it would be great for them to have more trade, but trade agreements are not particularly interested in the least developed countries or countries which have got really poor governance. In terms of agreements, in terms of the impacts of agreements, that's more kind of a middle and high income countries' business. And I think that there you have to be really careful if the benefits are only kind of articulated in terms of the low-income countries, which is, I think, also the card that EU plays in the international policies. It wants to support the low-income countries with special kind of requirements for them, and they don't even have to kind of apply TRIPS agreement because of the kind of the extension of the requirements. So you just need to kind of see what is the argument that is given, and on what grounds, and where it will be applying. So my answer would be that for the low-income countries and countries in kind of in crisis, not that much, and they would be happy to do more trading, and food security would be the most kind of important issue that you would actually deal with in many countries. But when you talk about countries with middle and high income countries, then the trade agreements start to be kind of more important.
Okay, thank you very much, Meri. We have Silke. You've had your hand up as well. I think you're next. Do you?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Hi, Charlotte and Meri. It's nice to see you both. Thank you for a great talk. I have a quick kind of comment, sort of from the Christmas tree, and then I also have a question. So, for those of you who don't know, I've been doing a lot of work recently with Erin Hanna and Adrian Roberts on the gender and trade agenda, and I found it quite interesting. That you were saying, the EU has this positive agenda in the trade agreements, and gender is a part of it, because we have recently been analysing the various gender chapters in free trade agreements that are now becoming kind of more mainstream. And the interesting thing I found in relation to the talk that you gave was that actually, Chile is a country that has a lot of gender chapters in trade agreements. And if you look at the gender chapters they have with other Latin American countries, whether it's Uruguay or Argentina or even with Canada, there is actually mention in the chapters of things like care policies, social policies, where you could maybe start actually seeing the overlap with health, right? You can sort of go, oh, maybe there's something a little bit concrete. But the EU is now negotiating an agreement with Chile, and the proposed text for the gender chapter leaves all of that out. So in the EU-Chile negotiations, it actually follows the Canadian model of gender chapters, which is very focused on women entrepreneurs, women investors, women traders. So so it's just, I just thought I let you know, because the EU could have gone with the Chilean template, which has something a little bit on it, but they didn't. And why didn't they? And maybe you want to ask them this one day. I would want to know. Then my question to Meri is around dispute settlement. So we know that the WTO appellate body is dysfunctional now. So I was wondering about these new generation trade agreements, and when we look at dispute settlement, things that relate to health services, when you speak of the failed cases, do you know if the cases that we have seen up to now, whether they come under the dispute settlement function of the agreement, or whether they come more under investment arbitration? And I think there might be qualitative difference there in terms of the public interest, but I'm not sure. I'm just asking your thoughts on this. Thanks.
I'm not absolutely sure if I'm answering to the right thing, but what I would kind of think about in terms of the arbitration, and because of the investment arbitration, I think that there is a difference in terms of the quality of cases, because what you can have more is the industry-driven cases in the arbitration, because they are free to kind of do that without the governments. And I think that the governments are less keen on doing and going after the health or welfare systems of other governments, because they may feel vulnerable themselves, or that's not kind of being considered as much as appropriate. I mean, that things might change, and I think that we always kind of forget that one of the first cases was the Good Canada asbestos case in terms of challenging the EU asbestos legislation, which really shocked a lot of people, and finally, luckily, kind of was managed to kind of be changed. But I think that it describes that it's usually, I think that the governments are more reluctant to take other governments on dispute unless there is a very strong industry interest in the background, and there they might kind of go further, but also that they are not that. I think that after the tobacco cases and others, there might be also certain reluctance with governments to kind of go on that, unless with the certain governments. I don't know. I think that in certain cases you also have paid ones, because you had governments taking other governments in WTO on tobacco-related cases when they didn't have major tobacco industry in any case. So that must be a favor to kind of something else. So there is all kind of a politics going on in terms of the dispute settlement bodies, I think. But I think that in terms of the investment arbitration, I think that there is also the point that it's easier for industries to take you to the arbitration in comparison to the other forms of dispute settlement in practice. And I think that I would absolutely, I think that it's absolutely where when we looked at the gender and the EU, that's what you kind of tell about the Chile agreement fits to that very much, that as long as it's markets oriented, it's liberal, and it goes to a correct way of type of direction, then gender is there, and it could make a difference in certain countries where women's rights are kind of limited. But I think that it's in the liberal context. It's the context of the liberal markets that you kind of promote. EU has always seemed to promote gender issues, I think also before, and it would be really interesting to see if there would be a feminist way of kind of looking at that it's not just the gender, but it would be a feminist way of looking what could a kind of a trade agreement which would have been negotiated for to kind of take into account such.
We have a paper, Meri.
I know you've got a paper, but have you done it to the end to kind of push it to the kind of a proposal? Because in the end, I think what we need to go is to kind of look and propose something that, you have to kind of go and say, okay, then you need to say no, you need to have explicit kind of limit, or you need to kind of have it formulated so that it serves the ends in a way, a new agenda, what could be articulated. And I think that's much harder to kind of say, because government, of course, don't have the kind of similar issues. So it's easier to exclude stuff than to kind of make trade agreements that work for other sectors. But I would be really interested to try.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much, Silke and Meri. We have time for one last question, and I can see Gabriel's hand is up.
Yeah, hi everyone. Hi Meri. Thanks a lot for the very interesting talk. And I wanted to come in or pick up on something you were saying earlier about effectively the institutional locus of decision making. And of course you were talking about different EU bodies, right? But so one thing that struck me about the EU's or the Commission's new trade strategy or communication, apart from the word salad, right, the open, sustainable and assertive, was the fact that there's much more of an emphasis on autonomous tools, but also on using the tools that already exist in FTAs, right? And although they don't, I think, use the term, what we're talking about here are things like joint committees, joint bodies. And so this reminded me of all the talk in the context of TTIP of the dangers of living agreements, right? The idea that effectively you kind of push regulatory decision making that's maybe too controversial for the context of an FTA discussion where you might have parliamentary scrutiny getting in the way to a joint body. And so, I just was wondering what your thoughts were on, how this might play out in the EU's future trade policy, because of course, this whole agenda is being framed very much in terms of, a level playing field, promoting TSD, right? Sorry, trade and sustainable development. So yeah, I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I think that my thought would be they're definitely not there. And but I'm slightly kind of worried about the kind of new trade agenda, even though there is this autonomous and this and that, which is but I've been told is implies that certain member states have been taken on board through that kind of a language. But if you look at what then seems to be the direction where the things are going, they don't seem to have changed much. And for me, the more interesting bit seems to be in the internal policies that the EU looks at trade differently. In the DG competition now makes a real global kind of a different type of effort rather than maybe in the trade. And I wonder if it's because the trade policies are so much informed about the export needs and the needs for the European industries. That it's very hard to kind of make progressive trade policies with so much kind of influence from the corporate sector in securing the interest, because on the other hand, I mean, I can see that it is important for them to kind of take the issues more out from the scrutiny of parliamentary scrutiny and take them to be kind of dealt with in a context of industrial policies and not as something that's shared with parliaments, and I think that there will be kind of a push to do that. So I think that your kind of points are quite what I think that there is the risk what you can see. But I mean, yes, I mean that's all I can say. But I think that in some sense I've also kind of thinking that EU is surprising factor as well. We're now kind of looking at in comparison with the UK and the EU, and a lot of the politics that people have made. And I think that there is also a lot of kind of scope for people to do joint work. And I hope that I would really want to kind of have people to joining their focus to have the EU different member states to look at the trade policies and where the interests are. And to kind of make a case, because there is that opportunity to do that, and I think that in the end of the day, it would serve Commission to listen to the kind of to take where the limits and opportunities for trade are, and to act upon that, because that applies also to internal markets. So if they go very strongly with the kind of transnational corporations and other interest parties, then they may also endanger the unity of the European Union itself through the kind of not just external, but through the internal policies that the external policies require. Because, for example, standards, EU didn't have any standards in the internal market, but you slowly, if you look at now, there are some initiatives on standards and standardization. And harmonization. So in a way, I think that there used to be a great division between trade and internal EU policies, but I'm not so sure how big that is in terms of DG growth and the kind of internal markets and the kind of trade policies that the EU might want to have. And that draws back to kind of the Charlotte's first issue about the better regulation, which is kind of comes back to the internal markets and introduction of mechanism that you then want to kind of move also and implement also as part of trade. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But thanks, I mean, good questions, and it would be, if you're interested, I'm really happy to kind of continue on these issues.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Meri, and thank you also to all the people who asked a question and contributed to this really interesting discussion. Yes, I mean it's 3 o'clock. I think this brings this session to an end. Again, I just want to say thanks so much for your time, Meri, and for your really interesting insights. Just so you know, we will be posting the recording, I think maybe next week or in a few days' time onto our website. And again, if you want to stay up to date with EUHealthGov's activity, check out our Twitter and sign up to the mailing list if you want at EUHealthGov. Okay, then thank you very much, everyone. Have a great afternoon.